Sticking with some of the statistics we were talking about before, yes, we conduct a net zero economy index each year. I mentioned that in my opening remarks. And yes, the world does need to decarbonize, at least according to that index, 20 times faster. But even to meet some of the lowest end of the Paris Agreement's ambitions, it requires a step change in progress, requiring an annual decarbonisation rate of closer to 7% rather than the 1% that we're at the moment. So we are really not moving along at the rates that are needed. In terms of another report that we do looking at purely US decarbonisation, again, companies will say they are achieving their own ambitions and targets at a time where 10 out of the 11 main industry sectors are significantly behind where they need to be ultimately. Other statistics from other things that we look at, we survey global CEOs every year. Nearly a third of global CEOs say that climate change will actually drive the way that they create value as organizations, then deliver and capture that value. So clearly very important. And as my opening remarks referenced, the rate at which climate actually impacts businesses right across the board and then ultimately global GDP is very, very significant. Global investor survey we do, majority of investors, 70% or so, say they will increase their level of investment in companies that are actually focused in a very positive and constructive way around sustainability matters. So no shortage of data around the subject. It was great to have a scientist's point of view on where things stand, but this is a conference also about insurance. And so what we're going to talk about for the next 20 to 30 minutes is just that, the intersection between insurance and obviously the science. Just to get things underway though, Sir Andrew, if I may, perhaps we could start with a little bit of a perspective on what it is that insurance has to offer, what stability it provides, and some thoughts around some of the bigger challenges of insurance to start.
Well, thanks for that. Perhaps I can look at this or put this in a slightly different context from what we've been hearing today so far. I've spent the last 20 odd years or so worrying about financial stability. We're all of us quite clear that if the climate change challenges are going to be met, vast amounts of capital are going to be needed. And if vast amounts of capital are going to be made available, we're going to require stability. So I think that there is an interconnect here between the contribution that the industry can make, the insurance industry can make, and the overall long-term stability of financial markets. Perhaps I could just give two very brief aspects of that. On the property and casualty side, we've obviously heard quite a bit today about the contribution that is being made by that sector, and clearly the more the protection cap gets reduced, the less impact it will have on the fiscal resources available to governments, which basically will be valuable. Indirectly, of course, the contribution of the industry, I think, has also been referred to today in terms of its risk expertise, in terms of the influence it can have on building codes, on planning, etc., all of which, again, move in that same direction. But even in the long-term insurance, I would suggest there is a connection, which is this, that to the extent that the protection gap is not met, there will be extra fiscal pressure on governments because they will be forced to find other ways of looking after those who otherwise could be protected through forms of insurance. And so the more that the industry can contribute to that, the greater the impact will be on reducing fiscal pressure on governments, in turn reducing the the debt burdens that sovereign governments have, and consequently in enhancing the opportunities for financial stability to remain and the capital to keep flowing. So that's just a couple of observations that struck me very much from the conversations that we were hearing earlier.
Neil and Stephen, you're both known in the industry for some of the contributions you're making in terms of advancing the industry's response with respect to climate. But perhaps we might start with each of you just sharing your view in terms of how well the industry is currently responding to climate change, and perhaps just provide some of your reasons for that. So, Neil, shall we start with you?
Thank you. So I think throughout my life, if a problem seems bad enough, we tend to get together and write a new exclusion clause. And I think that certainly happened with communicable disease, Y2K, and all sorts of different things. And my observation about 2023 was it was a year with in excess of 100 billion of events. And a lot of the reinsurance market didn't actually end up paying that much in the way of claims. So if we are to continue to add value, we need to develop products that respond to balance sheet volatility. We can't just focus on one area. And so I would hope that we can see 4 years ago when we were looking at this market before we started Conduit, we were looking at what was then known as unmodeled events. They're now called secondary perils. And I have noticed a burgeoning of parametric markets, but I think the insurance market can bring so much more, which we can get into. But so far, I think we need to try harder.
Stephen, how about you?
I think that the insurance industry isn't a charity. It has shareholders, and we have to give a return on capital to our shareholders to justify them investing in us in the first place. And I think if we go away from that, we have no industry, actually. Having said that, if as an industry we can encourage the industrial world to think about the quantum of CO2 emissions that they are creating by their products, either in the use of their products or building their products, that's a good thing to do. I think we can helpfully fund the collection of data which is verifiable and can be used prospectively, and indeed other people can come in with far more money than the insurance industry has to invest in this type of project to see what is going to be the outcome. I mean, the amount of money, for example, the oil companies are spending in the future is vastly greater than it was even 5 and certainly 10 years ago. So to some extent, if we can be the catalyst for that, it's good. I mean, I do think that the politicians aren't always helpful. And again, apolitical comment. They tend to have a sort of a 5-year time horizon. That's the duration of their tenure. And this is not a 5-year problem. It's not a 10-year problem. It's not a 25-year problem. It's an infinitesimal problem. It's 150, 200, 500 years down the line. Now you may say, well, I don't care about that, but I think most of us who've part of family life, and as I get older, I move from my daughters to my grandchildren and start worrying about what type of life they're going to lead in 50 years' time. These things become very real and apparent. I get very cross when I hear people making statements like, for example, about electronic vehicles. This is the answer. Well, hang on a minute. Actually, they're 50% heavier than a petrol engine. You've got to get the lithium out of the ground. You've got to put the lithium in there afterwards. The cost of construction has its cost. Electricity, by the way, only 1/3 of that is clean. The other 2/3 is dirty fuel. So why is that de facto the answer for us moving around? You may or may not know that in 2026, Formula One is going on to sustainable fuel. And that is a requirement which has been known about within that industry for some time. And I think it'd be very interesting to see what comes out of that. I mean, a lot of things that we have in our day-to-day cars came from F1. Okay, I know it's the elitist sport, but in reality, what has been learned from that sport and the investment into that sport benefits all of us in terms of the cars we drive today and their efficiency. I mean, the average petrol engine now is twice as efficient as it was 15 years ago. I mean, that's a significant change. That we don't hear much about that. So I'm of the view that we're never going to get rid of CO2 emissions completely, ever. And politicians telling us that is just blowing smoke, honestly. I think we can, without doubt, reduce the emissions that we expend in the way we live and how we travel and how we eat our food, all sorts of things. But we're always going to have some CO2 emissions, and therefore we need to find carbon sinks. And the thing that Callum and we've got involved in the last two and a half years now, we're looking at basically the seashore and the continental shelves around the world, is a substantial amount of the globe. And if you look at what's happened heretofore, a lot of concentration and absorption of CO2 on land. Great, needs to be done. Full in approval of that. But I think when we've looked at the amount of thought and money and investment put into the sea, I mean, the sea is 7 miles deep in places. It's a very, very large part of our globe in which we live. And we haven't really yet concentrated on how can we use that as a carbon sink. And it seems to me to be lunacy that we haven't done that. This is an extremely complex subject, and it's very easy for any one of us to form a view on a narrow database. This is a very broad database, and that's the challenge, is to understand what that database is actually saying to us.
So, Stephen, you talked about the importance of the industry as a catalyst for change. Callum, just if we focus a little bit on the project you're working on, it'd be, I think, fascinating for the audience to understand a little bit more detail what you're looking at and what you hope will come out of it.
One of the interesting areas of the ocean is the bit that's offshore that people don't normally go and look at. So, we all know about mangrove forests, seagrass beds, coral reefs. Those are the immediately accessible coastal wetland habitats. They're very charismatic and wonderful. But beneath that, deeper down, humanity has used this area of water which extends off the continents and goes down to about 200 meters deep. Very intensively for hundreds of years. We've been using it, we've been catching fish from it. The continental shelves provide 95% of the world's fish landings, and so they're fundamentally very productive in important places, but they also are storing large amounts of carbon in the sediment. So organic carbon sort of falls down as marine snow, dead bodies, all the bits of plankton and fish that when they die, it all settles down to the bottom, and that gets incorporated. It's buried in the sediment, and when it gets deeper than about 20 centimeters, it's anoxic, and so it sits there as carbon, and it's stored on hundreds to thousands of year timescale. So it's a very valuable carbon sink. If you then stir it up again and resuspend it, then you're squandering that carbon sink. And so the question is, can we enhance, can we intensify the ability of the ocean to capture carbon? And by the way, can we make sure that the carbon that's already there and is being stored stays there? I think one of the interesting things about the ocean and why we're particularly keen on it is, we've seen in just the last 12 months, the world's terrestrial carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks faltering. And so, ironically, you know, the nature that we are hoping will capture carbon for us and help us with mitigation of climate change is falling victim to climate change. And so we got wildfires, we got droughts, we've got melting of the permafrost. All of those things releases carbon. And so there was a report just recently that said that in 2023, you know, nature on land absorb virtually zero carbon because the net losses and gains. But the ocean stores, you know, we don't have droughts or wildfires there, and there's not much melting of permafrost that can go on. So these should be more secure stores if we can make them work for us, I think.
And I think, Neil, you talked about this the other week when we spoke, just the importance of not harming the planet as a basis to focus on nature-based solutions, which are a lot more effective than man-made solutions. I don't know whether you want to touch on that point.
Yeah, so nature is much better at taking carbon out of the sky than man-made devices. And what is vital is that we find ways of actually, what needs to happen, there needs to be legislation to admit offsets, nature-based, into mandatory carbon reduction systems. The size of the global carbon market, it turns over $1 trillion a year in notional value dollars. And only 0.2% of that is carbon offsetting. And that needs to be adopted, and there needs to be leadership. That will give industry the opportunity to invest and back projects like yours. And it'll allow monetization of natural habitat and goods. I cannot see a downside. Offsetting does have connotations about greenwashing and other things, and some parts of the press have been against it, but we need to protect nature and we need to create markets, and it needs finance. I mean, your project is being financed and that's fantastic, but it needs monetization and it needs investment.
Just for everyone's benefit, we will ask a polling question shortly, so get your phones out and ready. Callum, just back to you again. What are some of the better, more promising technologies that you're seeing in the context of decarbonisation?
It's interesting. You know, I know Andrew Forrest, an Australian mining magnate, and he's very interested in decarbonising mining. Yeah? And you might think this is one of the last industries in the world that you'd be able to get away from carbon with. But they're investing a huge amount of money in real green hydrogen, green ammonia, in order to run the equipment that's necessary to extract iron ore in very large quantities. And they're doing pretty well. And his target is that Fortescue, his company, will be decarbonized, not just sort of net zero basis, but on a real zero basis, you know, no carbon emissions by 2030. Now what he wants to do is to demonstrate that it's possible to a skeptical world, frankly, and I hope that it is. But those sorts of technologies, I think, you know, the most promising decarbonization technologies are clearly renewable energy. You know, solar power, wind. Those are deployable at scale right now and are producing, you know, the kind of energy that you need to be able to create green hydrogen and green ammonia and so on. So, you know, we know that it is possible to decarbonize. I think a lot of what is holding us up is politics and costs. And, you know, the industries that have most to lose from decarbonization are inevitably fighting tooth and nail to slow things down, and that's where leadership really comes in. You know, our politicians need to lead on what is good for society in the long term, not what is good for the nearest lobbyists to them, and that will benefit their short-term political career.
So, Stephen, you mentioned something a little earlier in your remarks about shareholders and what shareholders want from their investments in companies. Tell us a little bit about how you were able to get the backing of your shareholders to do some of the projects that you've done over the last several decades. I'm also, I think, just as a follow-up, curious to understand, how do you see that work being a real catalyst to change for the industry overall?
Well, to be perfectly honest, the first one we did was the Arctic survey, and I was really driven, if I'm truthful, for getting global brand awareness. And we decided that we didn't want to support the arts or sport. Very glad everybody else does it so we can go and enjoy it. But we wanted to do something that was relevant to our business. And the Arctic survey was done nearly 18 years ago, at a time when most people probably couldn't, of this room 20 years ago, would not have accepted the concept of global warming or climate change. That's where we were. And when you look at what's happened in a relatively short space of time, the actual public awareness of what the issues are has grown enormously. The Arctic survey was measuring the thickness of the ice in the Arctic. As you know, it floats. You can't do it by satellite and radar. They can't tell between ice and snow. The only way you can do it the good old-fashioned way and get a rod and drill down. The going-in perception was that the Arctic was about, on average, 9 meters deep. When we finished that, it transpired it was 3 meters deep. That's quite a big difference. And by the way, it wasn't the sun that was doing the damage. It was the Gulf Stream coming out like a cauliflower underneath. This was what was actually melting the ice. We then moved on to the Sea View survey, which is looking at polar bear, at coral, and seeing the bleaching corals. Some of the bleaching of coral is terrifying. We've got half the coral we used to have 15 years ago, roughly speaking. If you go to the Barrier Reef, if you like diving, and you're a bit older like me, and I did it 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, and then went again about 5 years ago, I was absolutely horrified by the naked eye at the change that had happened. Actually, often caused by man-made activity, part of it the warming of the water, the greater acidity, part of it the insecticides going into the water off land. By the way, I made them do it here in Bermuda, and the state of coral in Bermuda is about the finest in the world. And I had a bit of a fight with them to do this. I said, actually, I'm paying the bill, so I think I can decide. I have my other reasons. I also had an intuition that, we don't have any real insecticides here. We don't have the effluent going into the sea here that we have elsewhere. I've spoken to the Premier about this on more than one occasion. Actually, if there's any country in the world that could become CO2 neutral, the easiest is probably Bermuda. It's got wind, it's got tide, it's got sun, and it's relatively bereft of man-made pollution, in fact. Obviously, that's a political hot potato. But the advantage of those two was you had sex appeal. You had the polar bears, lovely coral and beautiful fish. This one is mud. It's quite difficult to get sort of energetic about mud. But as Callum mentioned earlier on, the way we fish the seashore at the moment with dredgers that dredge up about that much of the seabed on every dredge is insane. We don't need to catch fish that way. And if we didn't catch the fish that way, but where the carbon goes initially, as far as we can tell, and you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, I know, is about that depth of the seabed. And then it filters down deeper. But if you take away that first filtration, you're minimizing the amount of absorption of carbon just because a man thinks it's easier to dredge fish by dredging the floor of the seabed at the same time. I mean, honestly, that's an easy one to take one step back and say, we shouldn't do it. I think the other thing about when you're looking at the water versus land, I mean, we all know about the Amazon forest. It's a great absorber of CO2. However, if you think about the size of the Amazon forest as a percentage of the globe, and think about the size of seashores and continental shelves around the world, one's about, what should you say, 0.1%, and the other one is 15 to 20% of the globe. Yeah, the Amazon's great, and yet, hooray, we do something about it. But what about thinking about a really big carbon sink that we really don't know much about? So from our point of view at Convex, it's always been, if we can provide verifiable data, freely available to any scientist anywhere in the world, it's up to them what they do with it. And we've tried to be the instigator of some serious money going into research, way beyond what we could afford. And it's worked so far. It's worked for the survey. It's worked for the Seaview survey. I mean, did you know, just a throwaway line, every heart drug has got coral reef in it. So you've got no coral reef, you've got no heart drugs. That's not very good, is it? I think this one is really exciting. And all we will do is scratch the surface and give other people the reason to look into it. I was taken to lunch in the House of Lords once at the time of the Arctic survey, and ministerial peer took me to lunch, and he said, "Stephen, you know what your trouble is?" So I said, "No." He said, "You don't know what you're talking about." And I said to him, "You know what? You're absolutely right." And that's precisely the reason why we're doing data collection, try and find out what we should be talking about. He was the person who did not accept global warming at all. And at the end of the lunch, I said to him, out of interest, where are you investing money to demonstrate that you're right? And as you say, I'm wrong. And I haven't even said anything yet. It was the last thing he ever said to me.
All right, audience, if I may, we have a polling question. So as climate change intensifies, how will parametric markets grow? Give you a few seconds rather. All right, well, that's pretty stable. As far as you're concerned, strong growth and exponential growth tend to win out, with strong growth being the clear favourite. So Andrew, you talked about the protection gap, and clearly the protection gap is significant, and climate risks are obviously increasing in size and frequency. Neil, I'm going to ask you the question: is the industry being bold enough in its response to applying capital to risk? You made a remark earlier about 2023 and running away a little bit, but is it being bold enough? And if not, what needs to change?
Yeah, I think that we are applying capital to risk, and the industry is in a robust place. And I think it's coming to terms with how to price the product that we currently underwrite, and we've seen that with global reinsurance returns over the last couple of years. The new products and responding to a change in loss pattern and weather events is where the capital and the opportunity may need to go. So yes, I see an industry that is prepared to engage in difficult places, and we've just seen a pretty active hurricane season in Florida, which is a hard place to take on lots of cat risk. But yes, the industry is stepping up. The question about parametric, we do need to innovate and develop products. I think we are seeing that. We've just got to accelerate that drive. And Sir Andrew mentioned the coverage gap. The one thing I do believe about our industry is that we price risk with our eyes open. And when we don't price risk, it is assumed into equity markets or governments with their eyes shut. We have seen populations in areas that are deeply threatened, like Florida. It just keeps them, people move there for tax breaks without thinking about the actual consequence in terms of where they're actually living. So we do price risk. We take risk on board, and I think we can demonstrate so many other tangential benefits of being in insurance. I think insurance encourages prevention. When you insure your house, you have to fit burglar alarms and you have to fit smoke alarms and locks on your windows and doors. When you buy cyber coverage, you'll suddenly find that there's new types of disciplines imposed on your business. I've noticed that the claim pattern in Milton may be slightly different because some properties were also involved in Ian and have been reconstructed to new building codes. So we do encourage resilience. I think the other thing the industry gives is post-event response. We're very good at dealing with very large amounts of claims very quickly, which is what you need to do to mitigate catastrophic events. So I can see plenty of reasons why the product really does bring value. I would love to see us looking at severe convective storm, wildfire, and flood in a different way, because I couldn't bear to see a market that at some point will soften when we're only selling half the product we could be. But
Stephen, as an underwriter by training, what's your perspective there?
I don't disagree with what Neil said. I mean, I think I sometimes wonder whether we do price properly or with the right knowledge, but I think we could do better at that. But I mean, if you use, let's say, California and Florida as examples, California's got this fog going straight through it. Less than 10% of property in California is actually covering quake. Why? Because the state will pay, and if the state doesn't pay, the government will pay, the federal government will pay. And in Florida, you know, the building regs in Florida are probably some of the highest in the world, and they therefore do withstand wind and tide in a way that others don't. But at the end of the day, I think one could take one step back and say, look, if you choose to live on the San Andreas Fault in California, you're taking on a risk. If you choose to have a property in Florida on the seashore, you're taking on a risk. That's perfectly okay, but expect to pay for the consequences of that risk, either by not buying insurance or by paying a price for that insurance, which is relative to the risk that the underwriter is taking on. And I think we've got ourselves in a bit of an imbalance in terms of, well, somebody has a right to live there, therefore they should pay the average price for the average building in that particular country. Doesn't really work, I don't think. And if you choose to build a property in a floodplain, a known floodplain, well, that's your choice. And therefore you need to pay appropriately for that. So we seem to have gone quite a long way away from properly pricing risk in respect to the region it is actually in, rather than a great big territory where there's so many different types of dynamics, it's not actually relevant.
So Andrew, do you care to comment?
I've got a slightly different take on it, whilst agreeing with all the points that have been made, which is this: if we're going to keep the capital flowing, I was quite struck this morning by the comment that was made that the regulators don't trust each other. Well, I've been a regulator too, and I think the reason that happens is because any regulator who is reliant in a global market on regulators in other jurisdictions doing their bit, they will feel that they haven't got control of the situation, and they will want to be 100% certain that nothing's going to go wrong, because if it does, they will be the ones who will be blamed. So I think here there's there's work to do at the official level of getting regulators in different jurisdictions more closely aware of the mutuality of this whole set of issues. This is a global situation we're facing, and it requires global facilitation, if you like. Nobody's asking for lower standards, not at all. Indeed, from all the comments we heard this morning, everybody's very comfortable with high standards because high standards is going to anyway be good for businesses. But there's a lot more to do here, so I'm sorry to move it away from the industry itself, because I think this falls within the official sector. I think that in conversations that you may all have with regulators, it's not a bad idea to say from time to time, look, how do you actually get on with your counterparts in country A or country B or country C or other parts of the world in which we operate? Because unless you have trust in each other, it's going to make it more difficult for us to invest the capital that we need to contribute to the protection gap.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask our audience? They can be scientific or insurance-based or even regulatory-based. Any questions? There must be some. There's one over here.
I'm just curious of the panel's opinion on why we never hear anything about nuclear energy and looking into that as an alternative source.
You want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, what I was observing today is the US has just announced they're actually going to build 3 new nukes. I think there is, I mean, the UK famously has Hinkley, which is probably going to produce the most expensive power on the planet, and has come in at about 3 times budget and years late. And I take your point about solar and wind being so cheap by comparison, so long as you can equalize the grid. And that's about power storage. One of the unique things about fossil fuel is it's a power store and you can move it around. So someone was once asked, what's the cheapest battery in the world? And he said, a lump of coal. And so I think nukes get overshadowed. I think at some point there will be technology where you get small nuclear on a distributed basis. But one could even envisage a time when there's the technology to get rid of the grid and to have distributed power and power storage. The biggest wealth creation event in the 20th century was the end of the mainframe, and looking at what's just transpired with technology. And maybe in the 21st century, it'll be the end of the grid and people being much smarter, but properties designed to create their own energy. So I think nuclear stuff's important to an extent. The other thing I'd observe, people talk about energy security. About 50% of the world's source of uranium comes out of Russia, Uzbekistan. And after the Ukrainian invasion, the price of nuclear feedstock went up as much as the price of gas. So from an energy security perspective, so I think at the end of the day, we need every tool in the box, but I think it's sort of been overshadowed.
Callum, want to comment on that? No, nothing to add. Very good. Any other questions? Okay, well, what I'd like to do, I think, from each of you, just to wrap things up a little bit, is we've got a room full of industry leaders, people who care clearly about our planet and the future, and naturally care about the industry that they're in. What would your call to arms be to them? What are the sorts of actions that you would hope for that this room might take as they leave? So, Callum, why don't we start with you and we'll work down the line.
Well, I think this industry is very well placed to make a big difference to making some of that transition in energy possible, and really, by ensuring the the green transition, and also, you know, investing in nature-based solutions. I think that area, that combination of, you know, the shift away from fossil fuels, the protection of nature, the delivery of high-integrity carbon credits, those are three things that the insurance industry should help facilitate, I think.
Stephen?
Well, I think we should remember that solar, wind and tide have no downside in terms of what's left behind. And I would ask the question, are we really globally making the best use of those three powerful sources of energy, which is for free often? So, I mean, I think there's a mindset change that could be had there. I think from an insurance perspective, helping and fund the collection of data, which is verifiable, so that, forgive me, politicians stop speaking with hot air, they speak with fact, would help. And it would help if we had other energy suppliers speaking with fact, not fiction. So let's really understand what we've got. Let's really understand where we're going to go with CO2 in terms of production. We're not going to stop it. It's not, that won't happen. Can we cut it back? I would think we can. How much? I don't think anybody knows. And then from that say, right, okay, so how do we store this carbon forever? I mean, the thing about nuclear that I've never liked is the nuclear waste. And, you know, even when I was at school, I thought, well, this doesn't really make sense, really, because there's a waste product here which is dangerous, and it could bite us later on. So looking at energy sources which don't have a waste product is an upside as well. And it's something where the industry should work with governments, should work with energy suppliers, and try and find the best solutions available to us at that time. And I'm quite certain that what we do in the next 10 years will be quite different to what we're doing in, say, 50 years. I think you'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So I'm sort of minded to reflect. World War II was obvious it was coming, and you could, you know, in retrospect, it was obvious from the middle of the 30s, but no one wanted to address the actual issue. And then the UK was in itself being bombed. It took Pearl Harbor. It was that moment when the world realized, and America in particular, that they had to do something. What we then saw was people being prepared to make sacrifices, but also change behaviors. The amount of innovation that occurred, we went from a biplane to a fighter jet in a short matter of years, not to mention nuclear sort of atom bombs and things like that. Now, what will be the climate Pearl Harbor moment? And I think that's worth us reflecting as being in the insurance industry. Could it be a major city burning to the ground? Could it be the type of hurricane we haven't seen before? But I think we need to put that in our thinking. But once, and I think we may have, or I may have experienced one Pearl Harbor moment in my life, which was World Trade Center. It led to a fundamental change. It led to Iraq, Afghanistan, the Arab Spring. So what will be the Pearl Harbor moment for climate? The insurance industry will have to innovate, but suddenly when you realize the challenge, that's when you are prepared to make change and innovate, which is what we'll need to do.
Thank you. Sir Andrew?
Well, I'm not sure I can add to that very much, other than saying that it seems to me that all we've been discussing and hearing today gives me optimism that the industry itself is going to be determined to do all that it can to make a contribution to this dramatic issue that we face. And in keeping that global agenda alive, I think that that in itself will be important at a time when there are political currents that are moving in the opposite direction. And the importance of keeping the whole issue of climate change one which can be looked at above politics as something that's of existential danger to all of us and for which our grandchildren will not thank us if we do nothing. That seems to me to be the most important factor that could be introduced.
Thank you. My biggest learning, I think, is do no harm. The planet has an amazing capacity to solve these issues if we stop harming it. So thanks very much for a science view, but also an insurance view. Sir Andrew, Neil, Stephen, Callum, thanks very much indeed.